Ladies and gentlemen, today we confront a psychological paradox that has left countless individuals confused, frustrated, and emotionally exhausted. It is a dilemma of perception and reality, a contradiction between external detachment and internal desperation. Why does a man who so clearly yearns for connection behave as though he is indifferent to it? Why does he turn away when all he truly desires is closeness? To understand this, we must first examine the societal conditioning of men. From a young age, boys are taught that emotional restraint is synonymous with strength. They are told explicitly or implicitly that vulnerability is a liability, that to display need is to surrender power. And so they learn to mask their desires, to veil their longing, to pretend they do not care. But beneath this facade lies an undeniable truth. They do care deeply. However, the fear of vulnerability is ever present. To care is to risk pain, to open oneself up to rejection, to expose the fragile core of one's being. And so a defense mechanism emerges: detachment. If one appears unaffected, then one cannot be hurt. If one feigns disinterest, then rejection loses its sting. This is not rational, but it is deeply human. This creates what we call cognitive dissonance. The mind pulls in two opposing directions. The heart craves intimacy, but the psyche resists exposure. The result? A man may distance himself from what he most desires, a tragic irony that often leaves both partners confused and wounded. But understanding this pattern offers a solution. If you recognize that avoidance is often fear in disguise, you can approach such individuals with patience and wisdom. You do not need to play the same game of distance. Instead, allow space for safety, for honesty, for a slow unveiling of the truth. And if, in the end, he is unwilling to step beyond his fear, then understand this: you are not obligated to wait for a man to heal himself. True strength is not in avoidance, but in the courage to confront one's deepest fears. To desire is human. To acknowledge it is powerful. And to embrace it is the first step toward genuine connection. From an early age, boys are conditioned to suppress their emotions in ways that shape their entire psychological framework. Society has long held an expectation that men must be strong, composed, and unaffected by emotional turbulence. The phrase "boys don't cry" is not just an offhand comment. It is a deeply ingrained societal norm that communicates a profound message. Emotional expression is weakness. When young boys experience sadness, disappointment, or even deep affection, they quickly learn that displaying such emotions can lead to ridicule, dismissal, or in some cases, outright rejection. The natural response? Adaptation, suppression. A quiet but powerful internalization of the idea that to be a man means to be in control, to be unaffected, and to never reveal emotional vulnerability. This conditioning is not simply a set of arbitrary cultural expectations. It is reinforced through nearly every facet of male socialization. A young boy who falls and scrapes his knee is often told to toughen up. A teenager who expresses heartbreak is met with advice to just move on or not let her see you cry. Even in adulthood, men who openly express emotions outside the realm of anger or humor are often perceived as weak, overly sensitive, or even unmasculine. This rigid framework for male behavior does not eradicate emotions. It merely forces them beneath the surface, where they continue to exist, often in unexamined and destructive ways. Over time, the suppression of emotions becomes second nature. It is not that men do not feel deeply. On the contrary, they feel just as intensely as anyone else. The difference is that many have never been given the tools to process those emotions in a healthy way. They have been trained, in a very real sense, to suppress their needs, their desires, and their fears in favor of presenting a facade of composure and self-sufficiency. And this facade is often so convincing that even they begin to believe it. But the human psyche is not so easily deceived. What happens to these buried emotions? They do not simply disappear. Instead, they manifest in indirect ways through withdrawal, detachment, or emotional unavailability. A man who has learned to equate vulnerability with weakness will often avoid situations that require emotional honesty, even when he deeply desires connection. He may act indifferent, not because he truly does not care, but because caring, at least openly, feels unsafe. In relationships, this pattern can be particularly damaging. A man who craves closeness but has been conditioned to suppress emotional expression may send mixed signals. He may pursue a romantic interest intensely, only to retreat when the relationship begins to demand a level of openness that feels foreign to him. He may genuinely love his partner but struggle to articulate that love in ways that feel meaningful. His actions may be inconsistent, one moment affectionate and engaged, the next distant and cold, not because his feelings have changed, but because his ability to express them has been stunted by years of emotional conditioning. This is why so many men appear to act like they don't care, when in reality, they are desperate for connection. It is not an act of malice, nor is it necessarily a conscious choice. Rather, it is the result of deeply ingrained social conditioning that has taught them to prioritize emotional self-preservation over genuine intimacy. For many men, the fear of appearing too needy, too emotional, or too vulnerable is so overwhelming that they would rather suffer in silence than risk exposing their true desires. But while emotional suppression may offer a temporary shield from discomfort, it comes at a great cost. Human connection thrives on authenticity. A relationship in which one person is unable or unwilling to express their true feelings will inevitably suffer under the weight of unspoken needs and unmet expectations. Emotional repression can lead to frustration, miscommunication, and ultimately disconnection. It is the paradox of male emotional conditioning. In the pursuit of protecting themselves, many men inadvertently sabotage the very relationships they long for. Breaking free from this pattern requires a fundamental shift in understanding. It requires an acknowledgement that vulnerability is not weakness, but strength. That true masculinity is not found in emotional suppression, but in the ability to engage with one's emotions in an honest and constructive way. This is not an easy process. Undoing years of social conditioning takes time, effort, and often a willingness to confront deeply ingrained fears. But it is necessary, because a man who cannot acknowledge his own emotions cannot fully engage in the depth of human relationships. For those who find themselves in relationships with emotionally reserved men, patience and understanding can go a long way. But it is also important to recognize that change must come from within. No one can force another person to open up. They must be willing to do the work themselves. Encouragement, emotional safety, and open communication can help create an environment where vulnerability feels less threatening. However, it is equally important to set boundaries and recognize when emotional unavailability is preventing true intimacy. Ultimately, the journey toward emotional openness is not just about relationships, it is about personal growth. When men begin to challenge the outdated narratives of emotional suppression, they open themselves up to deeper, more fulfilling connections. They become not just better partners, but better fathers, better friends, and better individuals. Because true strength is not in pretending not to care, but in having the courage to embrace the full spectrum of human emotion. The fear of vulnerability is one of the most deeply ingrained and powerful psychological forces in human behavior. It is a defense mechanism, an evolutionary safeguard that has developed over time to protect individuals from emotional harm. Vulnerability requires exposure. It demands that a person open themselves up to the possibility of rejection, disappointment, and even betrayal. And for many men, particularly those who have been conditioned to equate emotional openness with weakness, this is an unbearable risk. The fear is not simply about discomfort. It is about survival in the social and emotional landscape. From an evolutionary perspective, human beings have always sought to protect themselves from threats, whether physical or emotional. In ancient tribal societies, displaying weakness could mean exclusion, a loss of status, or even death. While society has evolved far beyond those times, the underlying psychological mechanisms remain. Emotional exposure can feel just as dangerous as physical vulnerability. If a man expresses his feelings and is met with rejection or ridicule, it reinforces the belief that vulnerability is dangerous, something to be avoided at all costs. This fear often manifests in avoidance behaviors. A man may deflect deep conversations, joke about serious matters, or shift the focus away from himself when emotions come into play. He may adopt a posture of detachment, acting as though he is unaffected by emotional situations, when in reality he is deeply invested. He may distance himself not because he lacks affection or care, but because being too emotionally close exposes him to the possibility of pain. The mind, in its attempt to protect itself, creates a paradox. The more he desires connection, the more he may withdraw from it. This withdrawal can be incredibly confusing for both the man experiencing it and the people around him. It is not uncommon to hear stories of men who pursue relationships intensely at first, only to suddenly pull away when emotional depth is required. This is not a matter of lost interest or deceit. It is often an unconscious response to the growing weight of emotional expectations. The closer he gets to someone, the more real the potential for emotional pain becomes. And so, instead of leaning into the connection, he may shut down, becoming emotionally distant or even cold. This pattern does not only apply to romantic relationships. Friendships, family dynamics, and even professional relationships can be affected by a man's inability to engage emotionally. A father may struggle to tell his children he loves them, not because he does not feel it, but because the words themselves make him feel exposed. A friend may avoid discussing personal struggles even when he desperately needs support, because admitting vulnerability feels like an admission of failure. A man in a leadership position may hesitate to show concern for his team beyond a professional level, fearing that emotional closeness might undermine his authority. This avoidance of vulnerability does not mean that emotions disappear. They do not fade into the background unnoticed. Instead, they manifest in other ways, sometimes through anger, sometimes through sarcasm, sometimes through a quiet sense of loneliness that lingers just beneath the surface. Many men who fear vulnerability find themselves trapped in a cycle of emotional repression, where feelings build up over time only to erupt in ways that are unexpected or even destructive. The inability to express sadness, disappointment, or love in a direct way can lead to resentment, passive aggressiveness, or even explosive outbursts. The tragedy of this cycle is that it often results in the very thing these men fear most: disconnection. By avoiding vulnerability, they create distance between themselves and those who care about them. Relationships suffer, misunderstandings arise, and a sense of isolation grows. The irony is that what they truly crave, deep, meaningful connection, is only accessible through the very thing they have been taught to fear. Breaking free from this pattern requires unlearning deeply ingrained beliefs about masculinity, strength, and emotional expression. It is not an easy process, nor is it one that happens overnight. For many men, acknowledging the fear of vulnerability is the first step. Recognizing that emotions are not a liability, but a fundamental part of the human experience, can be a profound shift. Understanding that strength is not in suppression, but in the ability to confront and process emotions in a healthy way, is crucial. It is also important to create environments where vulnerability feels safe. Many men who struggle with emotional openness do so because they have been conditioned to believe that expressing feelings will lead to rejection or ridicule. When they are met with patience, understanding, and genuine support, they may begin to see that vulnerability is not something to be feared, but embraced. This does not mean forcing someone to open up before they are ready, but rather providing the space and trust that allows them to do so on their own terms. For those who are in relationships with men who fear vulnerability, it is essential to recognize that their emotional distance is not necessarily a reflection of a lack of care. It is often a defense mechanism, a learned response that has been ingrained over years, if not decades. This does not mean tolerating emotional unavailability indefinitely, but understanding that true emotional intimacy requires patience and mutual effort. Encouraging honest conversations, showing empathy, and leading by example can help shift the dynamic over time. Ultimately, the fear of vulnerability is a barrier that stands between many men and the deep, fulfilling connections they seek. It is a fear rooted in outdated societal norms and reinforced by personal experiences. But it is a fear that can be overcome. When a man learns to embrace his emotions rather than suppress them, when he begins to see vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness, he opens himself up to a richer, more meaningful life. Because in the end, the ability to be truly seen, to be deeply known, and to be fully connected is not just a desire. It is a fundamental human need. The human mind is a complex structure built not just for rational thought and logic, but for protection. Protection from perceived threats, from emotional wounds, from the pain of rejection, and from the discomfort of self-exposure. One of the most powerful defense mechanisms the mind employs is the act of detachment, a seemingly counterintuitive strategy where an individual, despite deeply desiring connection, behaves in a manner that suggests the opposite. This contradiction is not mere indecisiveness, nor is it a lack of genuine emotion. Rather, it is a subconscious psychological shield, a way of mitigating risk by maintaining control over one's emotions and interactions. At the core of this mechanism is the idea of self-preservation. When someone has been hurt, whether in childhood, past relationships, or significant emotional experiences, the mind seeks to prevent a repeat of that pain. This is a learned response. If expressing vulnerability has previously led to disappointment, rejection, or betrayal, the brain internalizes a lesson. Opening up is dangerous. Emotional exposure is a liability, and the safest course of action is to avoid showing need altogether. Over time, this pattern solidifies into a habit and then into an identity. A man may convince himself that he does not need affection, that relationships are optional, that emotional depth is a burden rather than a gift. But beneath the surface, the craving remains strong, unfulfilled, and quietly tormenting him. This is why many men exhibit behaviors that appear contradictory. He may act indifferent, but his eyes linger just a little too long. He may avoid deep conversations, but his actions show care in ways he cannot verbalize. He may be hesitant to commit, but he still remains present, orbiting around the person person he desires, never fully engaging yet never fully walking away. This internal battle between longing and fear manifests in ways that are often misinterpreted. To those around him, he may appear dismissive, emotionally distant, or even uninterested, but in reality, his avoidance is not due to a lack of feeling. It is due to an overabundance of it. A key component of this defense mechanism is emotional regulation through detachment. The mind, in its attempt to maintain control, limits emotional highs and lows. By numbing himself to the possibility of rejection, a man also numbs himself to the possibility of deep connection. This creates a pattern where relationships are kept at arm's length, where he engages just enough to satisfy his need for companionship, but never enough to make himself truly vulnerable. In doing so, he maintains a sense of autonomy and control, but at the expense of genuine intimacy. This subconscious strategy often extends beyond romantic relationships and seeps into friendships, familial bonds, and even professional interactions. A man who fears emotional exposure may avoid conflict, fearing that any confrontation will make him appear weak. He may downplay his successes, refusing to celebrate or acknowledge achievements, because to take pride in something also means taking responsibility for potential failure. He may refrain from asking for help, not because he believes he can do everything alone, but because relying on others introduces the risk of disappointment. Over time, this emotional detachment can become isolating. A man may find himself surrounded by people, yet feeling profoundly alone. He may engage in surface-level conversations, participate in social events, and appear externally functional, all while experiencing an internal disconnect from those around him. This is the paradox of avoidance. While it serves as a short-term shield against emotional pain, it ultimately creates the very loneliness and longing that the individual was trying to escape in the first place. Breaking this cycle requires self-awareness and intentional effort. Recognizing that avoidance is a form of fear rather than genuine apathy is the first step toward change. Understanding that detachment is not strength, but a symptom of unprocessed emotional wounds allows a man to begin confronting the deeper issues at play. This process is neither immediate nor easy. It requires a willingness to examine past experiences, to acknowledge painful truths, and to accept the discomfort that comes with vulnerability. One of the greatest challenges in overcoming this pattern is rewiring deeply ingrained beliefs about emotional expression. If a man has spent years believing that emotions are a liability, simply telling him to open up will not be enough. He must unlearn the idea that vulnerability equals weakness. He must recognize that true confidence is not found in emotional suppression, but in the ability to navigate emotions with clarity. He must come to understand that connection is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. For those who care about someone exhibiting these behaviors, patience and understanding are crucial. It is easy to misinterpret emotional avoidance as indifference or a lack of care. It is easy to assume that someone who does not express love in traditional ways does not feel it at all. But in many cases, the opposite is true. A man who struggles to express emotions outwardly may still feel them intensely. He may show love in different ways, through acts of service, through quiet consistency, through protective instincts that speak louder than words. Recognizing these alternative expressions of affection can help bridge the gap between misunderstanding and genuine connection. However, it is also important to set boundaries. While understanding someone's emotional barriers is valuable, waiting indefinitely for them to overcome those barriers can be detrimental. Growth must be a mutual effort. If a man is unwilling to acknowledge his emotional avoidance or take steps toward change, then those around him must decide how much they are willing to endure. Emotional connection cannot be one-sided. It requires both individuals to be present, engaged, and willing to meet each other halfway. Ultimately, the key to breaking free from this subconscious defense mechanism lies in redefining what it means to be strong. Strength is not in avoidance. Strength is in honesty. It is in the courage to say, I am afraid, but I am willing to try. It is in the ability to acknowledge past wounds without letting them dictate the present. It is in choosing connection over isolation, even when it feels terrifying, because at the end of the day, the human need for love, for companionship, and for belonging is not a weakness. It is the very thing that gives life meaning. When a person has spent years suppressing their emotions, avoiding vulnerability, and constructing walls around their deepest fears, they begin to develop compensatory behaviors, actions that serve to maintain the illusion of control while simultaneously trying to meet their underlying emotional needs. One of the most common and perplexing manifestations of this internal conflict is the pattern of mixed signals. This is not a deliberate game, nor is it always a conscious choice. Rather, it is the result of a mind that is caught between two opposing forces, the desire for connection and the fear of emotional exposure. A man who struggles with this dynamic may find himself engaging in a push-pull pattern of behavior. He may initiate intimacy one moment only to withdraw the next. He may crave affection, yet resist the very thing he longs for. This contradiction is not a matter of emotional instability, but rather a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism designed to protect him from perceived threats. If he gets too close, he risks vulnerability. If he stays too distant, he risks loneliness. And so he oscillates between these extremes, never fully committing to either. At the heart of this behavior is a fundamental misunderstanding of emotional security. Many men who fear emotional exposure believe that attachment is dangerous, that giving too much of themselves to another person will result in loss, rejection, or even humiliation. This belief often stems from past experiences, whether childhood wounds, previous relationships, or broader societal conditioning. If someone has learned that emotional openness leads to pain, they will develop strategies to avoid that pain in the future. One of the most common strategies is to maintain a sense of unpredictability, ensuring that no one gets close enough to truly expose their inner world. This unpredictability often manifests as inconsistency. One day he may be warm, attentive, and deeply engaged in conversation. The next he may seem cold, distant, or even indifferent. This change is not because his feelings have suddenly shifted, but because his internal battle has momentarily tipped in favor of self-protection. The more emotionally intense the situation becomes, the greater the instinct to retreat. This is why many emotionally guarded men find themselves pulling away just as a relationship begins to deepen. The moment intimacy starts to feel real, their subconscious alarms go off, warning them that they are treading into dangerous territory. Yet, paradoxically, they do not truly want to leave. The need for emotional connection is as fundamental as the need for food or shelter. Even the most guarded individual cannot fully suppress this desire. And so after withdrawing, he will often return, perhaps with an apology, an affectionate gesture, or a renewed effort to reestablish closeness. But unless he confronts the underlying fear driving his behavior, this cycle will continue. He will seek connection, become overwhelmed, retreat into himself, and then repeat the process all over again. This cycle can be incredibly frustrating for those on the receiving end. It is difficult to trust someone who is inconsistent. It is painful to feel wanted one moment and discarded the next. Over time, this kind of emotional instability can erode the foundation of a relationship, leaving both parties feeling confused, hurt, and disconnected. The person on the other side of this dynamic may begin to question their own worth, wondering if they are the cause of the hot and cold behavior. But the truth is, this pattern has little to do with the other person and everything to do with the inner turmoil of the emotionally guarded individual. Breaking free from this cycle requires an active effort to dismantle the beliefs that fuel it. It begins with self-awareness, the recognition that this pattern is not serving anyone, least of all the person engaging in it. It requires an honest examination of past experiences, an acknowledgement of fears, and a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than avoiding it. Most importantly, it demands the development of healthier coping mechanisms. Instead of retreating at the first sign of emotional intensity, a man must learn to tolerate and process those emotions rather than being controlled by them. For those in relationships with someone who exhibits these patterns, it is important to set clear boundaries. While patience and understanding are valuable, they should not come at the cost of emotional well-being. It is not sustainable to constantly be on the receiving end of mixed signals, waiting for someone to decide whether they are ready to fully engage. Encouraging open communication can help, but ultimately change must come from within. A person who is unwilling to confront their fears will continue to repeat the same behaviors, no matter how much they care about the other person. What is essential to understand is that true emotional security does not come from avoiding vulnerability, but from embracing it. When a man learns to sit with his emotions rather than running from them, he begins to build a new kind of strength, the strength to stay, to engage fully, to express his needs and fears without shame. This is not an easy transformation, but it is a necessary one, because in the end, love and connection are not things that can be half-lived. They require presence, consistency, and the courage to face the very things one has spent so long avoiding. The journey toward emotional openness is not one of simple willpower or intellectual understanding. It is a deep, often painful restructuring of how one perceives vulnerability, relationships, and self-worth. For many men who have spent years, perhaps even decades, avoiding emotional exposure, the transition from guarded detachment to genuine connection is not immediate. It requires not only a shift in thinking, but also an active, consistent practice of emotional engagement. It is a process that demands courage, patience, and an unwavering commitment to growth. At its core, the challenge lies in unlearning deeply ingrained defense mechanisms. When someone has spent a lifetime believing that emotions are a liability, that closeness leads to pain, and that control is the key to safety, those beliefs do not simply dissolve overnight. They have been reinforced over time through personal experiences, cultural messaging, and sometimes even childhood conditioning. For many men, the fear of appearing weak, of being exposed in a way that makes them feel powerless, has been drilled into them for as long as they can remember. And so, to begin dismantling these patterns, they must first acknowledge that these beliefs are not truths, but learned responses. Responses that may have once served a purpose, but are now standing in the way of what they truly desire. One of the most difficult but essential steps in this process is learning how to sit with discomfort. When someone is accustomed to avoiding emotional depth, their instinct at the first sign of vulnerability is to retreat. This might manifest as withdrawing from conversations, using humor as a deflection, or shutting down emotionally in moments of tension. But true emotional growth requires resisting these impulses and instead choosing to remain present. It means recognizing that discomfort is not a signal to run, but a sign that growth is occurring. It is through these moments of unease that true change happens. When a man chooses to stay in a difficult conversation rather than shutting down, when he chooses to express what he is feeling rather than masking it with indifference, when he chooses to lean into connection rather than pulling away. Another critical component of this transformation is developing emotional literacy. Many men who struggle with vulnerability do so not because they lack feelings, but because they lack the language to express them. From an early age, they may have been conditioned to suppress emotional expression, leading to a limited ability to identify and articulate what they are experiencing. Instead of saying, "I feel hurt," they may express anger. Instead of saying, "I feel anxious," they may withdraw entirely. This emotional illiteracy creates a gap in communication, making it difficult not only for them to express their needs, but also for others to understand what is truly going on beneath the surface. Building emotional literacy is a deliberate process. It requires learning how to recognize emotions as they arise, naming them accurately, and finding ways to express them in a way that fosters connection rather than distance. This can be done through introspection, journaling, or even therapy. The goal is to bridge the gap between feeling and expression, allowing emotions to be processed in a healthy way rather than buried or distorted. Beyond personal introspection, a crucial aspect of emotional growth is actively practicing vulnerability in relationships. This does not mean suddenly becoming an open book overnight, nor does it mean sharing every thought and feeling indiscriminately. Rather, it means making small intentional choices to let others in. It could be as simple as expressing appreciation openly, admitting when something is hurt, or allowing oneself to rely on another person without fear of appearing weak. Vulnerability is a muscle, and like any muscle, it must be exercised consistently to become stronger. For many men, a major obstacle in this journey is the fear of how others will respond. If they have spent their lives associating emotional openness with rejection, they may assume that showing vulnerability will push people away. But what often happens is the opposite. Genuine vulnerability fosters deeper connections, creating trust and intimacy in a way that nothing else can. When someone is willing to be emotionally honest, it invites others to do the same, strengthening relationships rather than weakening them. However, it is also important to recognize that not every environment is safe for vulnerability. Some people, whether due to their own emotional limitations or unresolved issues, may react poorly to emotional openness. They may mock, dismiss, or minimize genuine expression, reinforcing the very fears that have kept someone guarded in the first place. This is why part of emotional growth also involves choosing relationships wisely, surrounding oneself with people who value and respect emotional authenticity rather than those who see it as a weakness. One of the most profound realizations that can emerge from this process is that true strength does not come from avoiding emotion, but from learning how to navigate it. Strength is not in detachment, but in resilience. The ability to face difficult emotions, process them, and move forward without being controlled by fear. It is in the willingness to embrace the full spectrum of human experience rather than cherry-picking only the emotions that feel safe. It is in the understanding that connection rather than isolation is what gives life meaning. Ultimately, the transition from emotional avoidance to emotional engagement is not about becoming a different person, but about becoming more fully oneself. It is about reclaiming the parts of oneself that have been suppressed out of fear, shame, or misguided notions of strength. It is about recognizing that to feel deeply is not a flaw, but a gift. And it is about choosing every day to move toward connection rather than away from it. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy is not the risk of being hurt, it is the risk of never fully living at all. The paradox of emotional detachment is not a sign of apathy, but a learned mechanism of self-protection. Many men who act indifferent while secretly craving connection are not emotionally void, but emotionally overwhelmed, trapped between the fear of vulnerability and the fundamental human need for closeness. Their avoidance is not a lack of feeling, but an excess of it, channeled into defensiveness rather than openness. Breaking free from this cycle requires courage, self-awareness, and a willingness to confront the fears that drive avoidance. True strength is not found in emotional suppression, but in the ability to engage fully, to express openly, and to remain present, even in discomfort. The journey from guarded detachment to genuine connection is not about becoming someone else. It is about rediscovering what has been buried under years of fear and conditioning. For those who struggle with emotional expression, the choice is clear. Remain in the illusion of control at the cost of deep connection, or step into vulnerability and embrace the richness of authentic relationships. Because at the end of the day, the greatest risk is not in opening up, it is in shutting out the very experiences that make life meaningful